Yes.
Donald Trump's ambassador in Ottawa again making waves, now saying Canada has no hope of getting any substantial tariff relief.
We put tariffs on everybody in the world.
In an interview with Radio-Canada, Pete Hoekstra says there will be no exceptions.
There's different tariffs for different parts of the world depending on economic circumstances and that, but the concept of tariffs is uniformly applied to everyone that we trade with.
Pete Hoekstra walked into a Radio-Canada interview trying to sound tough on trade. Instead, he may have just rattled the exact people Trump needs to keep calm ahead of the 2026 CUSMA review: investors, automakers, manufacturers, and U.S. corporate boards already nervous about North American instability. Because Hoekstra did not describe tariffs like temporary leverage, he described them like permanent policy. And that lands differently when the United States and Canada move more than CAD $3.6 billion in goods across the border every single day. Auto parts cross the border multiple times before a vehicle is finished. U.S. refineries still import roughly 4 million barrels of Canadian oil per day. American construction firms still depend heavily on Canadian aluminum, lumber, and potash. So when Trump's ambassador publicly says Canada should expect tariffs to continue, markets do not hear negotiation strategy anymore. They hear long-term operating risk. The controversy began after Pete Hoekstra defended Trump's tariff strategy in an interview this week, saying the United States is imposing tariffs globally and Canada should not expect meaningful exceptions. The comments arrived at the worst possible moment for U.S.-Canada relations because Ottawa was already moving into another dispute with Washington involving streaming regulation. Canada's broadcast regulator, the CRTC, announced a major expansion of its online streaming contribution rules. Under the new framework, large foreign streaming platforms, including Netflix, Disney+, Amazon Prime Video, Spotify, and Apple, would contribute 15% of Canadian revenue toward domestic media production. The regulator says the system could stabilize more than $2 billion in annual support for Canadian programming as traditional television revenues continue collapsing. American industry groups reacted immediately. The Motion Picture Association accused Canada of targeting U.S. companies. The U.S. Chamber of Commerce warned the policy could violate trade obligations under CUSMA. Trump trade officials also signaled the streaming dispute could become part of broader trade negotiations with Canada. Then Pierre Poilievre entered the story. The conservative leader warned Ottawa that escalating fights with Washington could trigger additional retaliation against Canadian industries already under tariff pressure, particularly steel, aluminum, forestry, and auto manufacturing. At almost the exact same time, Mark Carney confirmed he was heading to New York for meetings with investors, financial executives, and large American corporations. Not the White House, Wall Street. That distinction matters because Carney appears increasingly focused on convincing U.S. business leaders that Trump's tariff instability is becoming a direct threat to North American investment planning.
Hoekstra's comments did not only create political backlash in Ottawa, they created financial uncertainty inside the United States. For months, many companies assumed Trump's tariffs were temporary pressure tactics ahead of the mandatory 2026 CUSMA renegotiation process. But Hoekstra's wording changed the tone because he framed tariffs less like a negotiating weapon and more like a standing feature of American trade policy. That immediately changes long-term business calculations. Manufacturers begin delaying plant expansions. Procurement teams reconsider sourcing strategies. Institutional investors start pricing political volatility into North American industrial forecasts. And sectors already dealing with tight margins become even more exposed. The automotive industry is the clearest example. The Center for Automotive Research previously estimated that broad North American tariff escalation could add thousands of dollars to production costs per vehicle, depending on supply chain exposure. The U.S. auto system remains deeply integrated with Ontario manufacturing, where components move back and forth across the border constantly during assembly. That means instability itself becomes expensive, even before new tariffs are imposed.
The streaming dispute created another problem for Washington because the conflict is no longer isolated to factories and commodities. Now it is dragging major American technology and entertainment firms directly into the same trade battlefield. Netflix, Disney, Amazon, Spotify, Apple. And unlike smaller exporters, these companies have enormous lobbying influence inside Washington. The CRTC argues the new contribution rules simply modernize Canada's broadcasting system. Traditional Canadian broadcasters have historically contributed between 30 and 45% of revenues toward Canadian programming obligations. Under the revised framework, foreign streamers would still contribute significantly less. That gives Ottawa a strong political defense domestically. But from the American side, the concern is broader. If Canada successfully forces major streaming platforms to redirect local revenues into domestic media systems, other countries could attempt similar frameworks targeting U.S. digital companies. That is why the reaction from American lobby groups became so aggressive so quickly. The problem for Trump is that his tariff strategy is now colliding directly with some of America's most politically connected corporations.
This is where Hoekstra's comments may have truly backfired. Markets can tolerate temporary disruption. What investors struggle with is structural unpredictability. Large pension funds, energy firms, logistics companies, and manufacturers all rely on long-term planning assumptions. Once political instability starts looking permanent, capital becomes more cautious. And there are already signs of that pressure building. Reuters reported earlier this year that trade discussions between Ottawa and Washington had slowed significantly ahead of the upcoming CUSMA review, increasing uncertainty for companies dependent on cross-border supply chains. At the same time, several industries remain heavily dependent on Canada, whether Washington likes it or not. The United States imports about 87% of its potash from Canada. American refineries remain structurally dependent on Canadian heavy crude. Canada also remains America's largest export market overall. That creates an uncomfortable contradiction for Trump's tariff strategy. Washington wants leverage over Canada, but the deeper the uncertainty becomes, the more instability starts feeding back into the American economy itself.
Mark Carney appears to understand the pressure points very clearly. That explains why he is spending more time speaking to financial institutions and corporate America rather than trying to publicly negotiate through television cameras. Carney's message to investors is relatively simple. Canada may have political disagreements with Washington, but Ottawa is still trying to present itself as predictable, rules-based, and investment-oriented. And Trump's escalating tariff posture is making that contrast easier for Canada to sell internationally. Trade diversification discussions with Europe and Asia are accelerating. Canada is expanding partnerships involving LNG, critical minerals, nuclear energy, and defense manufacturing. Indo-Pacific cooperation has also become more important as Ottawa tries reducing long-term exposure to U.S. political volatility. None of that replaces the American market overnight, but it does gradually reduce dependence. And ironically, Trump's own ambassador may have helped justify that strategy politically inside Canada more than any Canadian official could have done alone.
Right now, the tension is still spreading. The streaming dispute remains unresolved. Trade negotiations remain stalled. Major industries on both sides of the border are trying to plan around growing political uncertainty ahead of the 2026 CUSMA review. And Pete Hoekstra may have accidentally confirmed the exact scenario North American markets were hoping to avoid. Not a short trade confrontation, but a future where tariff instability becomes a normal part of doing business between the United States and Canada. Because once companies start believing instability is permanent, they stop waiting for stability to return. They start reorganizing around the instability instead.
What makes Hoekstra's comments dangerous for Washington is that markets listen differently than politicians do. Politicians hear tough negotiating position. Investors hear long-term instability. And once that perception spreads through financial markets, the consequences start moving beyond headlines very quickly. Auto companies delay investment decisions, manufacturers become more cautious about expansion, supply chain managers start building backup sourcing strategies, and large investors begin questioning how stable North America's trade system will actually remain heading into the 2026 CUSMA review. That matters because the Canada-US economy was built around predictability. Factories in Ontario and the American Midwest were designed as one integrated manufacturing network. Energy infrastructure was built assuming stable cross-border cooperation. Even pension funds and institutional investors structured long-term planning around relatively stable trade rules. Hoekstra's comments disrupted that assumption, because once Trump's own ambassadors start sounding like tariffs are permanent policy rather than temporary leverage, uncertainty itself becomes part of the economic equation, and that may ultimately create pressure inside the United States itself from investors, corporations, and industries that depend on stable North American integration. Thanks for watching. If you found this analysis useful, subscribe to the channel for more coverage on Canada-US trade, industry, and political developments. And let us know in the comments, are Trump's tariffs creating leverage for Washington or creating too much uncertainty for businesses to tolerate long-term? We post new videos regularly covering major developments between Canada, the US, global trade, and economic policy. Take care, and I'll see you in the next video.